Avaya has changed my life.
Avaya has made me the woman I am today.
Avaya is my home.
Avaya is personal freedom.
Avaya is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about Avaya.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, Avaya, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.
Hello, Avaya family. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner Ike Allen and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of Avaya University. Avaya is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you so much for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Dr. Margaret Paul, is back with us today to talk about healing PTSD with inner bonding. Margaret is a best-selling author, co-creator of the Inner Bonding Self-Healing Process, and she has appeared on numerous radio and television programs, including Oprah. Margaret holds a PhD in psychology, is a relationship expert, public speaker, consultant, and artist. She has successfully worked with thousands and taught classes and seminars for over 50 years now. Welcome back to Avaya, Margaret.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, great to see you as always. And I'm so happy that you were able to talk with us about inner bonding as it relates to PTSD today. So for those who don't know what inner bonding is, can you share a little bit about what it is?
Yeah, so inner bonding is a really powerful 6-step pathway, self-healing pathway that anybody can learn. It's about learning to love yourself. It's about healing your false beliefs that we all absorbed as we were growing up. And it's about learning to connect with a higher source of love and truth so that you actually can tune into what is loving to you. Most of us absorbed from our parents and caregivers, how we were treated and how they treated themselves. And this is causing huge problems for most people today. So practicing inner bonding heals all that.
Okay, great. So let's talk about inner bonding as it relates to PTSD specifically. Why do you think the practice of inner bonding is so important for people who've had trauma and have PTSD?
Well, first of all, I've been actually working with people for 54 years now, and I have worked with the deepest trauma imaginable. I have worked with people who have tried everything else to heal their trauma, and we're finally able to heal with the help of inner bonding. The issue is that the trauma therapies are very good. EFT, the emotional freedom technique, somatic experiencing, TRE, the trauma release exercises, EMDR, they're excellent. But the problem is that because most of us have absorbed that critical voice from our growing up years, especially if we had trauma, we continue to treat ourselves the ways that we were treated or the ways that our caregivers or others treated themselves. We continue to re-traumatize ourselves. And this is what most people don't realize. So they do the trauma therapies, which are great for the short term, but for many people, they don't last. And they don't last because people are abandoning themselves over and over again. And until they learn actually to love themselves and to heal that voice that they absorbed as they were growing up, like I said, they continue to re-traumatize themselves. So inner bonding along with the trauma therapies is fantastic. That's what I work with people with. And as I've said, I work with people with unbelievable trauma, unbelievable abuse. But when they learn how to take responsibility for their feelings, when they learn about the deeper level of the false beliefs that they're operating from, and what's essential here is when they learn to access a higher source of love and truth, they can learn to see who they are in their true soul essence, because they can't know that from their ego, what we call the ego wounded self. They can't know it from that programmed part of ourselves. They can only know who they truly are from their higher guidance. And what most people don't know is that there is a part of our soul that was never injured. It is whole. No matter what people have been through, this part of us is still whole, but it's buried because of operating from that ego wounded self. And so as people learn to tap into that voice that's been abandoning them for so long, as they learn to open to their higher guidance, they begin to see who they are in their true soul essence. And that's what's incredibly healing. Once they really get who they are, they become motivated to learn to love themselves rather than continue to abandon themselves. And that's what goes so far in healing trauma.
I love that. I love especially that, right? There's that part of our soul that is whole and was not injured, was not traumatized, was not hurt, all of that. I think that's so just enlightening and amazing to hear. And so let's talk about the steps. Would you go through the steps with us to share about inner bonding?
So step one is the willingness to get present in your body. So let me first go through the four major ways people learn to abandon themselves. One of them is we learn to stay in our head because our feelings are in our body. And so when we go up in our head, we disconnect from our body, we dissociate. And of course, people who have had a lot of trauma have extreme dissociation. That dissociation is on a continuum from like multiple personality disorder or DID, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, all the way to just, like phasing out when something comes up. But we do learn to dissociate and go up in our head. Well, when we're in our head, we can't feel our feelings. We don't know they're there. And so we can't take responsibility for our feelings if we're up in our head. So step one is learning to go from our head down into our body, be present with our feelings and wanting responsibility for them. And this is not always easy. It was not easy for me. I learned to be in my head. I learned to tune into others' feelings, but I didn't know anything about my own. So it takes practice to get in our body. Another way we abandon ourselves is, like I said, we've absorbed the critical voice of people that we grew up with. And so our ego wounded self is generally very self-judgmental. We tell ourselves things like, oh, I've been too damaged. I can never heal. I'm a jerk. I'm not good enough. If I had been good enough, I wouldn't have had to go through all this. There's something wrong with me. I said the wrong thing. I did the wrong thing. I'll end up on the streets. I mean, it's on and on what that voice says. Well, of course, that's re-traumatizing. And a third way that most people learned is to numb out with various addictions, whether it's food or alcohol or drugs or processes like television or being online, being addicted to YouTube or to Facebook or video games or whatever, being addicted to sex, to pornography. There's so many ways that people have learned to numb out from their feelings rather than take responsibility for learning from them. The fourth way is we tend to make others responsible for our feelings. We tend to take our feelings and hand them over to somebody else. And if you think of your feelings like an inner child, that's our soul, and our soul often communicates through feelings. And if you were to take an actual child and keep trying to give them away, that child would be traumatized. Well, that's what we do on the inner level. We make others responsible, especially if we get into a relationship. Somebody else is supposed to make us happy. Somebody else is supposed to make us feel safe or whole or loved or lovable or whatever. Again, we're abandoning ourselves and traumatizing ourselves when we do that. So step one is getting in the body and being willing to feel all of your feelings and take responsibility for learning what they're telling you. All of our feelings have important information. And so when we learn to tune in, we get incredibly valuable information about whether we're loving ourselves or abandoning ourselves or what's happening with other people or with something external. We need to know that too. Our feelings let us know these things. Mm-hmm. Step two is we focus in our heart. And in inner bonding, there's only two intentions. One is the intention to learn about loving ourselves, and the other is the intention to protect against pain with various forms of self-abandoning, protective, controlling behaviors. So in step two, we consciously breathe into our heart, open to learning, and we teach people to visualize an older, wiser part of themselves, regardless of what their belief system is. If they were to visualize their higher self, they start to access information that's based on truth and on love. And so we have them visualize an older, wiser part of themselves and invite that love and compassion and strength and wisdom into their heart. And that's what creates what we call the loving adult. We need to be a loving adult in order to do the healing work we need to do. So that's step 2. And step 3, we go back in. Let's say that you breathed into your body in step 1 and you felt numb, or you felt empty, or you felt depressed or anxious or angry. Whatever the feeling is, you go back into the feeling. And you're asking, what am I telling you? How am I treating you? What am I doing or not doing? Not what's happening outside, not what somebody else is doing, unless somebody is like yelling at you and then it's obvious from outside. But most of the time, see, feelings like anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, anger, aloneness, emptiness, jealousy, these are what we call the wounded feelings. We're causing those with our self-abandonment. So if we tune in, we have any of those feelings, we're saying, what am I doing? What am I telling myself? How am I treating myself? And once we understand that, we go a little deeper into that wounded part of us. And we're asking, why are we doing that? Let's say that you're feeling anxious and you tune into the fact that you're judging yourself. You're telling yourself you have to be perfect. You have to say the right thing. You have to do the right thing. Well, we're asking, why? What do you believe? If you judge yourself and tell yourself you have to be perfect, what do you think that's going to accomplish? And that wounded part might say, well, if only I'm perfect, then I can control how other people feel about me, and then I'll be okay. Which means that the belief is other people define our worth, which in inner bonding, we need to learn to define our own worth, because making other people responsible is that 4th way of abandoning ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so we come upon a lot of false beliefs. Judging myself, telling myself I have to be perfect will get me to do things right. Well, it's exactly the opposite. Anytime we judge ourselves, we kind of immobilize ourselves. We don't do well from fear and pressure. We do well when we feel open and relaxed. People feel they can control others by being a certain way. That's a big false belief. We can influence others, but we can't control them. So we're tuning into our beliefs. And once we understand how we're treating ourselves and what we're telling ourselves, then in step 4, that's step 3, and step 4, we visualize our higher guidance again. And we're asking 2 questions. What is the truth about any of these beliefs? And what would be loving to ourselves? And I do this all day long. What's loving to me now? What's loving to me now? What's in my highest good now? And it's a really good habit to get into. Step 5, we take the loving action, whatever it is. And sometimes it's not easy to take. It may be to speak up with somebody. It may be to tune into the judgmental voice. It may be to practice step 1, getting in your body. It may be to change jobs. It may be to eat different. It may be to get some extra. I mean, so many things that could be loving to us. And once we take the loving action, step 6 is tuning in again. How are we feeling now? And if indeed we've taken a loving action, we're going to feel relief inside. Now, the more you learn and practice these 6 steps, the less you're abandoning yourself, which means the less you're re-traumatizing yourself, and the more healing takes place.
Beautiful. I so resonated with so much of that, but especially the part when you were talking about the perfectionism, because I think I personally 100% relate to that as using I must be perfect as a way to control others. And right, it's all about abandonment fears, at least for me. And that is just, I love that. So good.
See that you're creating the abandonment fears by abandoning yourself.
Right.
You know, as adults, an adult can't abandon us unless we're ill or mentally ill or physically ill. Abandonment means abandon somebody who can't take care of themselves. We can abandon a child. We can abandon an older sick person who we've agreed to take care of. But when we feel abandoned as a functioning adult, it's not because of somebody else. It's because we're abandoning ourselves and telling ourselves we have to be perfect, putting that pressure on ourselves, telling ourselves, yes, then we can control others. And if they like us, we're okay. And if they don't, we're not. All of that is re-traumatizing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you mentioned multiple times throughout the last few minutes that one of the things we need to do is be responsible for our feelings, like how important that is. Can you dive a little deeper into why is it so important? Because I think a lot of people might have the idea that, oh, I can't control my feelings. Feelings just happen to me, or I experience them. Can you dive deeper into that responsibility piece?
Yeah. So like I said, well, there's two kinds of feelings. There's the feelings we cause, which we call the wounded feelings. And then there's the feelings of life. So like, let's say you feel full of love and you want to share your love with somebody and nobody's available, or person that's there is just shut down. You're going to feel lonely. And that's a natural feeling of life. In fact, loneliness has a lot of information. If I feel lonely around somebody, it lets me know they're not open, they're not available. And so I value the feeling of loneliness. It's information. We're going to feel grief if we lose someone we love, or we lose a job we love, or things like that. We lose something important. We're going to feel grief. We're going to feel heartbreak when people are mean to us, mean to themselves, mean to others. That's a natural feeling of life. We're going to feel helpless over others when others, it's like, what's happening in the Ukraine. A lot of people feel so helpless over what's happening. That's a normal life feeling, not an easy life feeling, but a normal life feeling. Those are the feelings that are happening from our external life. But then there's the feelings we cause, like we feel anxious because we're judging ourselves, we're putting pressure on ourselves. We feel depressed because we're ignoring ourselves. I didn't even know that I had feelings that I was responsible for. I didn't know I had an inner child. And so when we don't know that, when we ignore ourselves, we can get very depressed. A lot of people think that their anger comes from somebody else or something else, but it's usually a projection of all the ways we're abandoning ourselves, not taking care of ourselves. So taking responsibility for our feelings means that we want to learn what they're telling us. Like we want to learn what the wounded feelings are telling us about how we're abandoning ourselves. We want to learn what the existential painful feelings of life are telling us about what's happening externally. But nobody else is going to take care of those feelings. And if if you have a baby and you want to be a good parent and the baby cries, hopefully you have a baby monitor on and you go pick up the baby. You take responsibility for feeding the baby or changing the diaper or rocking the baby. And then when you take loving care of the baby stops crying. Mm-hmm. That's the same thing on the inner level. I call it having your inner baby monitor on. You're listening for the feelings so that you can learn from them. You can learn what they're telling you, and you can take loving action for yourself. That's what it means to take responsibility for your feelings.
I love the inner baby monitor. That's perfect. That's a great way of thinking of it. Awesome. Thank you for diving deeper into that. And I love that, right, you talked about the feelings that are caused by stuff that happens in life that we have no control over, right? And then the feelings that we do cause based on abandoning ourselves. So that was beautiful. So you mentioned a little while ago a couple other modalities like somatic experiencing and tapping. Are there any other modalities that you use in addition to inner bonding specifically for PTSD that you wanted to talk about?
Well, the TRE is really good. The trauma release exercises. I've had a lot of people work. I don't do it, but work with somebody who's trained in that. And it's very helpful in releasing the fear, releasing the trauma out of your body. I personally have worked with EFT for, I don't know, maybe 30, 35 years. I have found it to be extremely effective. But, not everybody responds to everything. Mm-hmm. And yet a lot of people will respond to any of these if they're also doing inner bonding. Got it. So for me, the TRE didn't work that well, but the EFT works really great for me. So if I get scared, I feel terrified of something, I'll do the EFT and it'll release it out of my body. And so people need to find out, they need to try. Is it EMDR that will work for them? Is it the SE that will work for them? There's many of them out there. Each person needs to find what works, but that's on the body level. You see, They're releasing the trauma on the body level, which is vitally important. But if they're abandoning themselves, if they're criticizing themselves, if they're treating themselves the ways that they were treated, they're going to still feel the trauma because now they're doing it. And that's why it's so important, along with inner bonding.
Got it. And I was just about to ask you, which you basically just said, but right, like how the wounded self continues to re-traumatize, right, over and over again. And it's like that self-critic, judgmental thing we're talking about, right?
Well, or just ignoring. I mean, many people were traumatized by extreme neglect. So, they're just left alone. And so if you're neglecting yourself, if you're not listening to yourself, you're re-traumatizing yourself. If you were traumatized by criticism, by various forms of abuse, and you're still telling yourself that you're no good, that it was your fault, that you deserve to be physically or sexually abused, you're re-traumatizing yourself. One of the things that's very difficult for most people is to feel the feeling of helplessness over external events. We're not helpless as adults over ourselves now, but we were when we were infants. And when we're infants, the only thing we have between life and death is our cry. And if we cried and nobody came, that was terrifying. That was traumatizing. We could have died if we were left alone. So the feeling of helplessness over things externally is very triggering for a lot of people. It can trigger life and death. If you were sexually abused, physically abused, you were helpless over it. And so that feeling of helplessness is a very hard feeling. But what people have to realize today is they're not infants. They're not toddlers. They're not helpless over themselves. When we were infants, we couldn't call a friend. We couldn't call an agency. We couldn't ask for help. We couldn't go to a refrigerator and get food. We were helpless over ourselves and others. Today, we're still helpless over others, but we're not helpless over ourselves. So it's so important not only to learn to love ourselves, but to learn to lovingly manage the feeling of helplessness over others. This is about managing these existential, painful feelings of life. Because if we don't learn to manage the loneliness, the grief, the heartbreak, and the helplessness, then we're going to turn to all the self-abandoning ways that we've learned to avoid our feelings. And so very often underneath the wounded feelings is a core feeling that we're avoiding. Not always, but often there's a core feeling we're avoiding. So it becomes so important to learn to be compassionate, to learn to be open to learning, a true, compassionate, open, loving adult with all of our feelings, both the wounded ones and the core ones. That's what heals.
You mentioned self-love many times, and I know that's a big part of inner bonding. What does self-love mean to you, and why is it important for us to love ourselves as it relates to trauma?
Well, self-love means that we do want responsibility for ourselves emotionally. A lot of people might be loving themselves physically. They might eat well, they might exercise, or they might be loving themselves organizationally, keeping on time and things like that. But it's so important to learn to take emotional responsibility, as well as physical, as well as financial, as well as organizational, as well as relational, as well as spiritual. These are all levels of responsibility that loving yourself is about. Because let's say, even if you're taking emotional responsibility, but you're not taking any financial responsibility, you might be very stressed. And then you're not taking care of that emotionally either. So these are all tied in. It means taking care of ourselves in all of these ways. The thing is, we don't know how to do that. We didn't have role models for that. And that's why it's so important to learn to access a higher source of love and truth. That's why I ask all day long, what's loving to me now? What's in my highest good now? Because when you learn to raise your frequency high enough to access your higher guidance, which means, number one, being open to learning, that raises your frequency. Number two, keeping your body clean and clear with good food, with good, healthy, fresh food. If people are eating junk food, eating a lot of sugar, it lowers the frequency. It's hard on the body, makes it hard for them to access their higher guidance. And so when we open to learning about loving ourselves and we eat well, we keep our body clean and clear. We can't do it if we're drinking a lot or taking drugs or smoking a lot. Any of those things will lower the frequency. So when people decide to love themselves enough, they're going to treat themselves well physically and emotionally and spiritually and all these levels. They're going to be able to easily access actually their higher guidance. Mm-hmm. And that's how they learn to love themselves. And of course, that's what heals trauma. When you're really loving yourself, you will heal your trauma. When you're abandoning yourself, you're re-traumatizing yourself.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you talking more about self-love. And one other question before we start wrapping up, what about shame? That comes up a lot also when we talk about trauma. It's something that many people experience post-trauma. Can you share a little bit about that emotion and how healing or inner bonding could help with that?
Yeah. So shame can come from two major sources. One is when we judge ourselves, we're causing shame. So anytime we judge ourselves, telling ourselves we're not good enough, which is basic to the wound itself, we're causing shame. We can also have absorbed the shame. Like we can absorb our parents' shame. We can absorb shame from the people around us without realizing it. But if somebody has been physically or sexually abused, they are always going to absorb the shame of the perpetrator because the perpetrator knows that what they're doing is wrong. And energetically, the child absorbs that shame. And I have a process I do with people to tune into that shame that's not actually theirs and release it out of their body. And it's very powerful when they realize that all that shame isn't theirs. It is theirs when they're judging themselves and abandoning themselves, but it's not theirs when they absorbed it as they were growing up.
That's very powerful. Just you saying that right there, not having done it, but wow, absolutely. I would make sense why one would absorb the shame from a perpetrator who knows that what they're doing is wrong.
Oh yeah. And the perpetrator in one way or another often tells the child it's their fault.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Well, if you hadn't done this, if you didn't look this way, or if you were good or this or that. And then of course the perpetrator often tells the child they can't say anything or they'll get punished. And so, yeah, the child absorbs all kinds of shame.
Gotcha. Thank you. I appreciate you touching on that. Let's talk a little bit more about how people can learn about you. So I know you have a free gift for everyone and a program, and there's a couple of links below leading over to your site. So what do you have for us?
So the 6 steps to profound self-love and joyous connection is a free ebook. It will introduce people to the inner bonding process. I write my books. I let my higher guidance write my book. So it's basically coming through from my guidance, and it will be very helpful for people in beginning to learn to love themselves. Then the other offering is a paid course. It's called Love Yourself. And it is an extremely powerful 30-day course where people get a video every day and get a text every day and an action step every day that will lead them through the inner bonding process to learning to love themselves. I've been offering this course for many years, and it's been life-changing for, I'd say at this point, hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, thank you so much for offering that to our Avaya students. And again, everyone watching, the buttons are below for those. Margaret, do you have any last insights before we wrap up?
What I want people to know is that you can heal. It's really up to you. There's no such thing as not being able to heal if you are motivated to learn to love yourself and then share your love with others. We can't actually love others if we don't have love to share. And when we're abandoning ourselves, we have no love to share. So the greatest joy in life is the sharing of love. And everybody can learn to do this if they learn to love themselves.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Always great to connect with you, Margaret. We really appreciate you. And thank you, everyone who's watching or listening right now, for loving yourself, for showing up for yourself today. And we will see you all again very soon. Take care. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this last class with Dr. Margaret Paul. She was back speaking with us today about healing PTSD with inner bonding. I love Margaret, absolutely love our time together, and I think she does such a beautiful job of describing inner bonding and going through the steps. And I think some of the big take-home messages for me were just stressing the different ways that we abandon ourselves as it relates to healing from trauma. Right. Step number one being we abandon ourselves by being in our heads. If I can definitely relate to that, and I'm sure so many of you can, like not being in our bodies and being in our heads and having all sorts of thoughts and disempowering thoughts and stories and beliefs and fears and all sorts of things happening in our heads, as opposed to being in our bodies and really breathing into how we're feeling in our bodies and not just what we're thinking in our heads. And the second way we abandon ourselves being that self-judgment, right? So a lot of those thoughts that are happening in our head when we're in our head are judgmental thoughts. They are telling us we are not good enough, or we deserve to not be happy, or it's our fault, or what have you, those kinds of things. Number three being numbing out with addictions. This could be obviously drugs and alcohol, sex, technology, any number of things, reading romance novels, right? You name it. Lots of different things can be addictive to different people. So numbing out in whatever way that you choose to numb out, right? And then a fourth one being making others responsible for our feelings. And we talked a lot about this one. I think this is so important, just recognizing that we are responsible for our feelings. And where we talked about the different kinds of ways we have our feelings, for lack of a better term, right, from the external world. And we might feel things like fear of death, right, the existential fears, fear of being alone, those kinds of things. And then there's the things that we feel based on what we're telling ourselves in our head and based on believing we're not good enough and all of those kinds of things. So being responsible for those feelings is so important. And I loved that Margaret talked about how feelings are information, and she recommended you to have your inner baby monitor on. I think that's a great way of thinking about that, really doing that inner child work and being a loving parent to that baby that is you, right? And having that inner baby monitor on so that you are taking responsibility for your feelings and helping yourself through that, not abandoning yourself. So I hope that you found this class helpful in your journey today, everyone, and we will see you again soon. Take care.
Avaya has changed my life.
Avaya has made me the woman I am today.
Avaya is my home.
Avaya is personal freedom.
Avaya is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about Avaya.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, Avaya, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at Avaya is what the world needs.